Okay, so this is our fourth and final part of India. We're going to finish out on some post-Guptan, Pallava, Palan, and then other periods. So let's get right into it. So, at the same time that the Gupta Empire is wrapping up, we have in southern India and the Tamil Nadu. This is the coastal region, right in this region. Between the 6th and the 9th century, we have the rise of an empire that we call the Pallava period, the Pallavan Empire. Not to be confused with the Palan Empire. The Pala Empire is up here in the Bengala region. So a lot of different kingdoms that we have to keep straight. It's towards the beginning of this period, in what might be called the post-Gupta period, because it's technically not under the control of the Pallavans yet, that we have what was best described to me by Jeff Cohen from the Society of Architectural Historians as the Rosetta Stone of Indian architecture. And I've always remembered that because it's very true. That's the site of Mamallapuram. So Mamallapuram is there on the coast in the Tamil Nadu region. There are rock-cut temples in the region. We've seen rock-cut temples before. But Mamallapuram also has some other built temples as well. But most of them are cut right out of the living rock. There's plenty of rock there. There's this quartzite boulders, which is as hard as granite and other items. And this is the natural landscape. So there's plenty of material to cut out of. And they would cut sculptures and features right into the stone. And here you can see that they are cutting a bull. The bull here is probably a sacred bull. It's probably a Vahana. It probably represents the Vahana or vehicle of Shiva, who rides on a bull. But either way, it's really remarkable, both in terms of technical skill. But it gives us a real insight into how Indian architecture becomes so very complex very quickly. Let's start with this boulder carving. This is a huge relief. It's nearly 100 feet long, nearly 15 feet high, and it dates from the earliest parts of this period. It's a naturally existing boulder, and there's a naturally existing cleft in the rock, and so they have carved out this narrative or series of narratives into the rock. So you can see that in the center here, we have a section where water would flow down the center of the rock, and it would fill this shallow basin in front. So this was already happening in the natural location. So they decided to carve a series of scenes, and the scenes are, kind of appropriate to what we're looking at. The first story that we can identify coming down this rock is the descent of the Ganges. So the Ganges is the sacred river that exists in the Hindu tradition. It is the great sacred river. And of course, as I mentioned before, waters and rivers are represented as nagas. There's these serpent spirits that often have the upper part of a human but the lower part of a serpent. And so you would have in this crevice, when it rained, water pouring like a waterfall over the top of these naga figures representing water. And then we have all of the gods who are in attendance watching this event. So this is all of the gods watching the Ganges. According to tradition, the Ganges descends from the heavens, being a sacred river, and you can see the water would flow over that. So they're very much building in the reality of the site to deal with it. It's kind of an augmentation of the natural flowing of the rock. Some of the other figures are a little bit more ambiguous. We do have a shrine that's right here, a relatively simple shrine. We have ascetics, monks who are gathered around the shrine. You can see them in their ascetic pose. And then we have this. We have this very emaciated ascetic who is right there next to a person holding a massive war club, and this is Shiva. And this is probably the penance of Arjuna. Arjuna is the hero of the Mahabharata, the great epic myth of the Pandavi brothers, and he has to go on this great quest. But every hero that goes on a quest needs an epic weapon, and so you need a weapon that comes from the gods themselves. And so he decides that he has to perform penance, this extraordinary act of asceticism. He starves himself, stands on the one leg, and endures this torture of the body to show that he has mastery over his body, that he is spiritually pure. And eventually this is the reason that Shiva sees that he is worthy of his kind of war mace and hands the war mace to him. So, but they're not just carving these big, beautiful narrative panels with these wonderful sinuous forms. They're also carving whole temples out of the rocks and the promontories that exist there. There's a whole series of these temples carved right out of the living rocks. These have these promontories and boulders, and they carved them down. There are 5 of these temples, and the temples are named for the heroes of the Mahabharata. So you have the Pandavi brothers, which is Arjuna, and then Bhima, Dhamaraja, Nakula, Sahadeva, and then you also have Draupadi. Draupadi is the wife. So it's 5 brothers all married to the same woman in the tradition. Now, these are just the traditional names for these. We honestly don't know who these temples were dedicated to. They were more or less abandoned, so these are kind of romantic names, but the names have been around for a very long time, so why not? So when we look at them, you can see this is the Draupadi shrine that exists right here, and it's a very, very simple shrine, and it gives you a sense of what these kind of shrines would have looked like when they were made out of wood and when they were on, chariots being carried around. They would have had a kind of wooden frame, wooden decorations. They would have had a cloth top or canopy. The other shrines are much more complex. So this is the Draupadi shrine, this is the Arjuna shrine, the Bhima shrine, Nakula Sahadeva shrine, and the Dhamaraja shrine. So when we look at the Draupadi shrine, one of the things that's interesting about all of these shrines is they were unfinished. If you look at the details, here we have one of these Yakshi figures. You can still see the tooling of the chisels. This is a very, very hard stone to work, and they never quite got to the finished layer. It's really kind of remarkable. They got to just close to finishing and stopped. Undoubtedly, a project like this was extraordinarily expensive. It took a lot of manned labor hours, and so for whatever reason, they seem to have run out of money or interest, and so it paused. But when we look at this shrine, notice it has this kind of architectural top. When we look at some of the other shrines, such as the Bhima shrine, you can see that it's a pavilion. Notice the end of it. Does that look familiar? It should. So if you remember in the last lecture, we had these Chaitya halls, and the Chaitya halls had these ends like this. So this is a representation of one of these, kind of movable temples that was made out of wood and covered with a cloth canopy. But I want you to look really closely, because look at this balustrade here. Notice this balustrade that's up here around the upper part. Do you notice these sections right here? This is in fact a miniature version of a shrine looking very similar to the whole shrine right there. So, and then it's replicated all the way across. So we have miniature shrine, miniature shrine, miniature shrine, miniature shrine, miniature shrine. So you have a miniature version of the whole there. So again, it's this multiplication of ornament, very similar to what we saw at Ajanta. You have these smaller shrines that represent iterations of the larger shrine. The multiplicity of ornament indicates that this increases the significance of it. It's an indicator of what it is. It's kind of like Inception. You got shrines on your shrines. Shrineception, if you will. You can see the same thing here on the Arjuna shrine. So first of all, look at these lovely sinuous characters that we have, but you can clearly make out that on the top of each one of these shrines, we have a balustrade, and the balustrade has itself another shrine. There's another shrine there, there's a shrine there. This shrine here is indicative of the canopy that would have been over the entire thing. So you can see these forms latent into this, and in fact, these little shrines look very much like the Draupadi shrine itself. Nearby, you can see here there's the end of one of the smaller shrines, the Nakula Sahadeva shrine, where you have again this end of a shrine, and there's even a shrine depicted in the end thereof. So you can see this a little bit more complicated nearby at Mahabalipuram. You have a series of shrines with a series of steps, but they're all subsequently pieces and parts of a smaller shrine. So this is very interesting, this concept of multiplicity, of multiplying an element. It doesn't really seem to have any upward limit. And so we're looking at temples from the 6th to 8th century here, but this idea continues well into the High Middle Ages, until eventually we have a temple like this. So this is the Arjuna shrine at Mamallapuram, and next to it on the right, this is what we call a Southern style temple, a Dravidian style temple. And this one comes from Brihadiswar. This is the Thanjavur in Thanjavur, Tamil Nadu. So this is the Brihadiswar temple, and you can see it's the same principle, except it's just much more dense. So instead of having 3 levels, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 15 or more levels, and the shrines keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And after a while, they blend into each other. They cease to be distinct architectural elements, and they become just kind of a decorative element. But it is essentially, again, it is the sum of the whole in each tiny little piece of it. It's like a hologram. A hologram contains the full piece of image in every part of the hologram, and each one of these contains in microcosm a smaller version of the concept of the whole. This continues on until we get later into the 13th century, and this one is so far advanced at this point. This is a Southern style temple. You can see that the shrines are still there. You can see that this is still the pavilion, this is still the balustrade. You can make out these shrines, but they've so blended them in together that it ceases to be an individual shrine and just becomes a decorative cornice. So the translation, you can see the steps going forward, how these things eventually become more and more complex until this architectural multiplication of elements, you can't even tell what's left. So if you were looking at a building like this would just be kind of, dizzying. How do I make sense of this? Where do these complex cornices come from? What are they meant to represent? But if you can see the steps in between, you get a sense, oh, that's what's happening. I'm actually looking at a smaller version of the shrine, and I'm looking at so many of them that they've just been multiplied in an almost fractal way to really create this wonderful sense of decoration. And this happens in both cases. There are pretty much 2 major styles to classical Hindu temples of the High Middle Ages. The first is going to be the Dravidian, which is what we've seen. Dravidian style temples are more pyramid shaped. They're very vertical. All pyramids, I guess all of them are very vertical, but these are more pyramid shaped, and you can almost see the shrines separated out. And then you have the northern style, Nagara style. These are not the only styles. There's many different styles, but these are the big ones that you probably need to know. And both of them are, again, the same kind of concept, that you take an architectural element and you multiply it till the original form is almost lost and it just becomes a formalist decoration. So as we move into medieval India, this is the great period of temple building in India. Again, a very fractured region. Take a look there. We have Kalinga in the east, Palas in the northeast, Chandelas in the middle, Karnal up to Cholas to the south, Pandyas to the south. It's every different kingdom, and these kingdoms overlap. It's a period of disunity. The biggest regional states are going to be the Pala Empire and the Chola Empire. And we'll talk a little bit about Pala art and Chola art in a little bit. But it's important to know that we have really a lot of different overlap. The Rashtrakutas dominate a region, and then we have Gujara, which dominates a region. But these areas all kind of overlap at various times. And so you see this growth and retreat. And it's because of this that we have really a real explosion. This is, while the Gupta period is kind of the classical period, this period would be analogous to the building of the great cathedrals in Europe. Like every little city in France has to have its own magnificent cathedral that's far, far larger than is needed for the local population. Again, these aren't needed for the local population. These are created as dynastic monuments. So let's take a look at some of these monuments. As we talked about cave temples before at Ajanta, another one of the great cave temple complexes, monastery complexes, is at Ellora. So this is 6th to 10th century CE. And here we see all three of the major religions, Buddhist, Hindu, Jain. The Buddhist and the Jain will start to peter out, as unlike Ajanta, which is almost entirely Buddhist with a few little Hindu elements, these are going to be predominantly Hindu, with a few Buddhist and Jain temples built in as well. We are seeing the decline of Buddhism in India. Really, by the 7th century, Buddhism is on its way out. Most of the local dynasties are sponsoring local deities and local temples that are very localized, very nationalized. And every nation will have its patron deity or collection of small set of patron deities, and not a Buddhist affiliation or patronage. And so the Buddhist patronage just dies out. It's not the predominant form of belief anymore. Things really go south in the 9th century. In the 9th century, we have a massive invasion across the north by Muslims. And from the 9th century onward, we're going to see increasing Muslim influence in India until by the time we reach the 13th, 14th century, most of India is going to be dominated by Muslim forces. Of course, the Hindus don't go anywhere. They're still there, but they're very much oppressed and suppressed underneath Muslim rule. And in the 9th century, the great Buddhist libraries at Nalanda are destroyed. And that was, Nalanda is up by Pataliputra, and that was the main site of Buddhist teachings in India, and it was the last surviving stronghold of Buddhist teachings. There were still people from China coming to there to be taught Buddhism, because remember, Buddhism starts in India, so you have people from China coming to get texts, to get books. If you've ever read Journey to the West, one of the 4 great classic Chinese novels, the whole premise of that story is a monk goes to India to get some books about Buddhism so he can learn more about Buddhism. But with the libraries destroyed in Nalanda in the 9th century, there's no longer the need for that. And Buddhism has, by that point, established itself across the Himalaya mountains into Nepal, and then eventually into Tibet, and then also into Southeast Asia, into places like Thailand and Burma, and down into Sri Lanka. So there's still plenty of Buddhists in Sri Lanka. There's still plenty of Buddhists in Burma and the Bay of Bengal. And there's still plenty of Buddhists in Nepal. But India doesn't have very many Buddhists left, and it starts at this time. So these are monasteries and temples. There's a whole series of these. We still have those Vihara halls, those large halls. And we still have some truly massive Chaitya halls that look very much like the late period halls that we saw at Ajanta. But it's going to be cave number 16, the Kailasha temple, that is really the most amazing. This temple is just breathtaking. Again, carved out of solid rock, so you can see how the stone hill sloped off, and what they did is they just simply removed all of the rock around it. So everything here is attached to the bedrock. It was part of the bedrock. It was just left free, and everything else was carved. Around the outside, we have these deep porches, where places where monks and gurus could gather to teach and to meditate. And in the center, we have a temple. The temple has a carved hall and a series of rooms on the interior. And here you can see that it looks very much like the fashion of the Mamallapuram temples. You can still see it's a little bit more ornate. It's not quite to the full development that we'll see later, but you can see how each part of this is itself a kind of representation of a shrine. So here you have a carved shrine. Here you see a miniature version of that same shrine. We have 4 lions either side of a kind of canopy here over the main hall of the temple on a lotus blossom. It's just astonishing. Full-size obelisks. The carving on this is just amazing. The bridges, the passageway. This is one monolithic block of stone connected to the rock and carved out on the inside as well on the outside. The skill and the effort to create this. Here's one of the overhangs. And again, this is something you could do if you're carving out of solid rock. You have such an amazing cantilevered piece of rock that's really only possible because you're carving out of massive monolithic structures. But look at this massive overhang. Look at the scale. The entire thing is carved to rest on the backs of elephants, and these elephants are nearly life-size, carved out of the rock. The carvings are really quite beautiful. They do have this very sensuous style. If anything, though, the artwork gets a little bit more stylized. It gets a little bit more exaggerated as we move into the later periods. Every square inch practically is carved in some detail. We also have one of the longest narrative reliefs that exist here. This is a relief of the Ramayana. The Ramayana is one of the great epic myths of India, and it tells the story of Rama. Rama is an incarnation of Vishnu who defeats Ravana, this 10-headed demon and monstrosity that kidnaps his wife Sita and takes her away to Lanka or Sri Lanka. And he fights all these battles. He, of course, has the help of his brother, Lakshmana, who is secretly the god Shiva, and also Hanuman. And Hanuman is, of course, you can see Hanuman being depicted here. Hanuman is this monkey god that has the ability to change size and has a whole army at his disposal and can teleport anywhere instantaneously in a single jump. It's really kind of amazing stuff. It's a great kind of romantic story. And so the whole scene is depicted out here, this wonderful kind of narrative, all these dynamic figures. Most of the temples in these cases are dedicated to Shiva. Shiva is the main deity in this case. Unlike Vishnu today, Vishnu is by far the most common deity worshipped in India today, but Shiva remains incredibly popular. And so this is Shiva and Parvati. So again, this gets a little into Hinduism, this idea of the divine coupling, the divine consort. Here they are resting on Mount Kailasha, which is where the Kailasha itself, the temple, is kind of a representation of the whole concept of the mountain. And so here you have Mount Kailasha, which is resting on the demon Ravana, or another variety of demon with 10 heads. Here he is trying to shake the mountain, and the whole mountain has been placed on top of him. And then the god and the goddess, his consort, seat here. The goddess is referred to as the Shakti. She is the feminine aspect of the god. And again, remember, in monism, all the gods are essentially one god. And if you have two gods, they are consorts of each other. And the Shakti is like the energy or the essence of the god, this kind of creative force in the god, and can be worshipped separately as a god herself, but is also connected and represents this principle or essence of the god. The same thing with the Vahana, the birdman Garuna that Vishnu rides around on, or the bull that Shiva rides around on. These are their vehicles, but their vehicles are also aspects of them that are some essence or part of them that's been distilled into its own separate entity. And you can worship these individually or separately. So as a Hindu worshiping these, even in the Middle Ages, each one of these would have taught you something about it, that each one of the aspects of these gods would teach you something about the nature of the god. And of course, there is this bhakti tradition, this tradition of that if you are truly devoted to the god will be your personal salvational god. So knowing the iconography and knowing this is a consort to the god, or this is a vehicle of the god, but this is still somehow the same god and an aspect of the divine meant to be understood in true meditation. So these are meditational images as well. So going back up to the north, going out to where the Ganges River empties out into the Bay of Bengal, we have Bengalan art, or some what's called Pala. So this is the Pala Empire, which dates to the 8th to 12th century. The Pala Empire sponsors both Buddhist and Hindu art. Remember, the north up to that region, that's where the first Buddhist councils were held. That's where the libraries of Nalanda were at. So this is kind of the heartland of, this is of course the region towards the north is where the original historical Buddha, Shakyamuni, Siddhartha Gautama, came from himself. So it makes sense that there's going to be a stronger, following of Buddhism up north, and it's down south maybe or into the central regions, the Deccan Plateau, where we break off more into these kind of nationalistic Hinduist nations. And they're going to formalize a lot of these Buddhist and Hindu forms. And they're going to export Mahayana Buddhism to Tibet and Nepal. They are just right across the mountains, the Himalaya mountains from Nepal and Tibet. And so a lot of the forms that we see in Tibetan art are going to be coming from the Pala period. They're known for large bronzes, and they're also known for these steatite icons. So this is a stone called steatite, and these are steatite steles. They have these rounded tops. So as we see this, you hopefully recognize the mudra. This is the Bhumisparsa. This is the earth witness. This is the moment of enlightenment for the historical Buddha. Notice that he has attendants, and notice that we have stupas on either side. So this thing has the general shape of a stupa. So all of these iconography of the Buddha is coming together. They're also going to be producers of large bronzes and manuscripts. We also have to talk a little bit about tantric beliefs. Tantra, or tantric beliefs, Tantra is a metaphysical philosophy, and it really comes about in a regimented meditational practice. This is a series of ascetic practices, regimented meditation that involves yoga, but also involves other kind of meditational and practices of fasting and asceticism. And it's really about control of the body in order to achieve higher spiritual understanding. And it starts to develop in the 5th century. We see treatments of it, but it becomes very, very popular during the Pala period. It influences both Hinduism and Buddhism. Tantra is not a religion. Tantra is a kind of philosophy or a practice that influences these religions. It has a strong influence on Tibet, particularly Vajrayana Buddhism. We'll see a lot of tantric practices there as well. And so when we see art, we'll see tantric couples. We'll also see, again, this concept of the consort. Here's every one of these consorts or couples represents a being and a part of its being that can be separated out almost as if it's a separate entity. And I see these a lot in these beautiful bronzes. So let's take a look more at these steatite icons. Beautiful, shaped like stupas. We have lions on either side, this kind of this very heraldic situation. Here he's making the Dharma chakra. That's the turning of the wheel. This is the teaching of the first sermon. But really these have become more devotional objects. Now here's where things get really interesting. As we move on from the 8th and 9th century into the 10th century, these steatite icons get more and more ornate. Beautiful. It's hard to believe these things are made out of steatite. Steatite's really a difficult stone to work with. And you can see the hands have been broken off. And what we're looking at here, okay, so apply your iconography. We're looking at multiple arms. Up until this point, we hadn't seen any Buddhist figures with multiple arms, so you could be forgiven of thinking, okay, well, this has to be Vishnu. He's carrying a mace. Things are going on here, so this is a Hindu icon, right? Wrong. This is actually Buddhist. And this is a bodhisattva. Remember, bodhisattvas in Gandhara and elsewhere were depicted as princes, as nobles. That is, they were borrowing on existing iconography to tell other truths, to give other kind of concepts. These were the spiritual princes. These were not worldly princes. These were princes of the metaphysical realm. These are mystical princes. So likewise, as you have these devotional deities and this practice of devotional deities in Hinduism, Buddhists look at that and say, okay, well, we have bodhisattvas. Bodhisattvas are personal protective guides that are there to lead us. And these bodhisattvas take on the role of devotional deities, and protective deities. And so the iconography of a multiplicity of arms that we see in Hinduism moves over into Buddhism. And so this is actually a bodhisattva. This is a bodhisattva seated on a lotus blossom, and its multiple arms, again, indicate this multiple aspects, this ability to provide protection. He holds what's left of a mace. I'm not sure what it would have been in the other hand, but the mace is a symbol of protection. You see, a lot of these figures come into play. This, again, is a bodhisattva. This one is Manjushri. Manjushri is this bodhisattva of wisdom. But when we look at this figure carries a lot of the ideas that we associate with Hinduism. It has three faces, like the Trimurti or Brahma. It has multiple arms. The arms hold many different artifacts, like a lotus or a sword. But it's very definitely Buddhist. You can see that we've got stupas up here. But the stupa here is nested inside of a Kalinga-style temple. A Kalinga-style temple is a Hindu-style temple. It comes from a little further down the coast. So they're borrowing. So it makes sense. You have Buddhists initially borrow from a variety of traditions. They borrow from Greeks and Indo-Greeks to create their imagery. Then Hindus create their imagery, borrowing from Buddhist imagery, and then Buddhists borrow back. So this character, Manjushri, is the bodhisattva of wisdom, and here he is in this manifestation as the tantric Manju Vajra. Okay, so this is really kind of amazing. So not only do bodhisattvas have different iterations, I mean, just like gods have different iterations, bodhisattvas can have different iterations. And again, Tantra creates different ideas. So Tantra creates these different ideas that you can have mystical, kind of interpretations. The carving on this is just exquisite. Really, Pala art is really high-end stuff. They really were masters of this. Notice that the elbows are a little sharper. We're losing a little bit of that curvilinear technique. We're getting much more of a kind of sharp detail, that boneless quality that we had seen go all the way through the Gupta and later Gupta period now is getting thinner, more elegant, and we have these dance-like poses. And even though these are three-dimensional objects, they're really meant to be seen almost as two-dimensional objects, to be seen from one direction. Where does this idea come from? Where does this new kind of depiction come from? Presumably there's a narrative art we're missing, but we do have a kind of clue. And that is the first genuine books, the first genuine manuscript illustrations that emerge from the Indian tradition come out of the Pala period and come out of the Pala Empire. And we can see on these beautiful little miniatures, highly developed miniatures that have very dynamic dancing figures, that have, more lightly, delicately rendered arms. Oh, excuse me, I'm yawning. Apologies. You have more lightly delicate rendered arms. This isn't coming out of nowhere. This is almost certainly a long-standing painting or narrative tradition that is lost to us, either because the books or the materials or the paintings didn't survive. Remember, a lot of these buildings are wood and they're covered in cloth. They're temporary buildings. I have to imagine that the wood and the cloth was painted, but those are not terribly durable materials. They don't survive even terribly well in cold and dry climates, let alone hot and wet climates like northeast India. When we look at these beautiful illustrations, this is a representation of Avalokitesvara. Avalokitesvara is this one of these. It's the bodhisattva, the one who looks down, the bodhisattva of compassion, who looks down. And here they are dispensing boons. What that means is that you can see the hand is out to gesture to individuals, giving them gifts. And these are gifts that will help them on their journey to enlightenment. Just like any kind of divine figure, they have attendants. And again, you can see that attendants have red skin. The different colored skins indicate different qualities. White and blue and yellow are almost always associated with divine figures. And so we have what appear to be yakshis and other divine figures as well. Red and blue, these are sacred, things. And the indication of the palms being red as well. This is, again, draped in jewels. All of this is kind of royal imagery. And then there's a parasol up there. So that imagery remains. Now, these are tiny, tiny little illustrations, and they exist in these very, very unusual books. These marvelous books that are written on dried palm fronds. Okay, so if you've ever seen a palm frond, you know that the individual leaves of a palm frond aren't terribly wide, maybe an inch or two at the widest, and they all go back to a central stalk. And so what they've done is they've cut a section out of those palm fronds. And so this is a dried palm frond here. You can see they've trimmed it off to the edges, and then the palm fronds are laid out, and then the writing is written, and then we have a miniature right in the center. On some of these miniatures, we have little stupas. So here you can see we have a stupa here, and a stupa here, and a stupa here, and a stupa here. And then we have these scenes of these bodhisattvas, or Buddhas, or what we call Dharma protectors. Here is another iteration. This one is going to be Avalokitesvara, again, a very popular bodhisattva. It's recognizable by their iconography. So recognize that this entire thing is at most 2 inches wide. So this little intricate illustration in the center of this religious text is, that I'm blowing up to full screen here, holy Canarphus. I mean, you can't even imagine it. All of this intricate detail, all of this greenery in the back, the stupa, Avalokitesvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, seated here. All of this is in a scene just 1.5 inches to 2 inches high. That's it. That's really remarkable. It's incredible skill. Now, as how these things work, that's something you may have noticed that, okay, these are parts of a book, but it doesn't look like any book I've ever seen. How did this work? Well, so these are all cut out, and you cut out the palm frond into, something about approximately 10 inches long. And then you have a panel on one side. Palm fronds are kind of brittle, so you really can't stitch them together and work them like a book. Plus, it would be kind of absurd to stitch them up on one side. I suppose you could stitch them from the top, but that would make it hard to get open. So these have a very interesting method of closing. Notice the holes. So the holes, a ribbon would be passed through the hole. And then you would just simply put the next palm frond on top of it, and the ribbon would pass through the holes here out to the next one. So you'd have a whole stack of these stacked on a pair of ribbons. And so this is actually a really cool book because they're not physically connected to each other except by this ribbon that passes through the central hole. And so when you unwrap the ribbon around the end, like a kind of lace, you can pull this apart and lay these all out separate, one on top of each other, like a full page, and read them that way. But when you're ready to go, you can just pull on those little ribbons, and the whole thing will close up like a stack. I had the hardest time describing how does this work until one of my students said, "You mean like Venetian blinds?" And I looked at her and I go, yes, exactly like Venetian blinds. So if you've ever seen Venetian blinds, when you pull on the thread, all those little slats just boop, they close up into a tidy little bundle. And that's exactly what these are. So this is a book, but it's organized like it's held together by a cord of kind of a ribbon that would function like Venetian blinds. It's really quite remarkable, and they really are just exceptionally beautiful. So this is the Avalokitesvara expounding the Dharma to a devotee. Really beautiful manuscripts out of the Pala period. So let's go down the coast a little bit and go down to the close to Kalinga temple styles, Nagara temple styles. So again, much like the southern style temples at Tamil Nadu, Mamallapuram, Mahabalipuram, and a few others, you can see that they start out relatively simple, that they start off as essentially square temples. And those square temples are inspired ultimately by the Temple of Vishnu at Daugar, which is the one that was we looked at under the Gupta period. And you can tell it's still the same idea of multiplication. Notice that we have a kind of pavilion edge here, but the pavilion has been stretched out long and thin on either side, and then has another pavilion and another pavilion, another pavilion, another pavilion stacked up. Same thing going here. So it's the same idea of the multiplication of elements one on top of each other. So the basic form emerges. Most of these temples are going to be dedicated to Shiva, and the temple is going to have a lingam. The lingam is the center stone. This represents the phallus, but it represents the creative principle of the god. And it functions much in the same way as a stupa. It's there to be circumambulated, again, clockwise. Over the top of it, it has a tower called a sakara, and the tower has a canopy that includes a malaka and a kalasa. These are the same things as a harmika and a chhatra. It represents a parasol. It's this parasol over the divine, space, and it rests immediately over the Shiva stone, the lingam, which is right there. Then out in the forecourt, you have an area for preparation. This is the mandapa. This is a hall. And then most temples started out with just the shrine here, the Gabra Griya. And then they would add a forehall called the mandapa. And then after that, they had an Ardha mandapa, which is a kind of forecourt to the mandapa. And so they get more and more complicated. So they start adding more and more halls out onto this. This one is a largely reconstructed temple. This one was an ancient temple, but it's been mostly rebuilt. But it gives a good view of what this looks like. So you have the Ardha mandapa, the mandapa, and then the sakara over the actual shrine itself. And then you can see that all of this is, again, you have like little edges here that indicate this is an edge of a pavilion. But in this case, instead of multiplying them across horizontally, like they do in the Dravidian and the Southern style, they squash them down flat and then pile them on top of each other. Multiplication of ornament. The Lingaraja temple is a complex of temples that shows how this develops and how complicated it can really be. Again, you have a bunch of the earlier temples. The smaller temples are a little bit simpler. They just have the sakara. The sakara itself is a kind of representation of the lingam, the creative kind of object. Here you can see the massive mandapa hall. That's the forecourt. And then behind that, you have this huge sakara. What I love about this, just kind of going back, if you look at this sakara, this tower, notice that the sakara has sakara on it. So the whole thing here comes with the kind of parasol, the kalasa on top of it, and then it has built into it little sakaras that also have little parasols, kalasas. You can see one off the side. You can see another one in there, and another one, and a smaller one. Oh, it's incredible. This is incredibly fractal understanding, the multiplication of ornament. This is major idea that's created here. It's really beautiful. You can see even better here all the different kind of things. So you take the whole, you miniaturize it, you place it on it, and it you can see it. Here you can see the Rajarani temple. This one just has a simple forecourt mandapa. It doesn't have the Ardha mandapa, and you can see this one's a little easier to see where the breaks are. Again, there's a sakara that's an emulation of the whole sakara itself. So it's just a hop, skip, and a jump from these styles to the later styles. And of course, all of these temples wind up being covered in just incredible sculpture, where we have a style that's not quite like the Palan style. The Palan style is a little more crisp. It's a little less rounded. The figures are more delicate. The figures in the Pala period aren't, even the female figures aren't nearly as zaftig, shall I say, as the figures that exist further down the south into the coast of Kalinga and into the Deccan region. You have much more rounded, much more sinewy figures. And these are, again, going to be our, our yakshis, our yakshi figures. Here we are several centuries on from the Satavahanas, but notice the iconography of our yakshis are very similar. Strong S-shaped spine, very curved features, emphasis on these round proportions, looking very boneless, dynamic view. We have this cross leg position. Legs cross each other. Figures are just incredibly animated. So now we move to a site in northern India. This is the Khajuraho group. This is the Nagara style temples, which have similarities to the Kalinga style temples, but are even more kind of ornate and have lots more sculpture. Again here, and you see the multiplication of ornaments. So we move from an Ardha Mandapa to a Mandapa, and then we have a Maha Mandapa, a great hall in between, before we finally get to the Sakara, and before we get to the Garbha Griha, the shrine inside. And again, this is just multiplication of ornament. Oh my gosh, I love this to death. See all these little sakaras in here. See how the top of the Mahamandapa is actually replicated in every little finial. So I mean, this is something, if you just looked at this, this is almost impossible to kind of pull apart. But if you see those early Indian temples, you can tell what the principle is. So again, the principle here is much the same as in stupas. You walk in and you circumambulate clockwise, and inside you have a lingam. This is one of the largest lingams. Again, the stone is a phallus symbol. It has a small reservoir around the base, so it can be anointed with oil, and the reservoir can catch the oil. It's anointed with both water and oil, and depending on the circumstances. And you worship this by circumambulating it around this way. All of this above you is almost solid masonry. It's really remarkable. Again, they never really get true arches in India, not until the arrival of the Muslims. And so this is a corbelled arch. So when you look at this, it looks like a massive temple, but most of this is solid masonry. There are open spaces here, and some open spaces to relieve weight, but most of this is solid masonry. It's really incredibly skilled that they could pull something like this off. The lingam stone, again, is a phallus symbol, but it's more an axis mundi, or a omphalos. It represents the center of the world. Again, it represents the center of the force and of creative power. And that's kind of strange because they're usually used in the worship of Shiva. But remember, destruction, life, death, and destruction is all one cycle. It's all the same thing in the Hindu universe. So this brings us to the Lakshmana temple, which is also part of this group. Really beautiful stuff. Again, you can see this form. This one is noted especially for its sculpture. We have the depiction of Shiva himself on the interior, but we have this wonderful depiction, Ganesha. And Ganesha has, again, the elephant head. He has multiple arms. Again, usually 4, but you can have a god with as many arms as you need the god to have to hold all of the devices. And things like axes, swords indicate his right, his ability to defend people from harm. Things like shells, bowls of food indicate his ability to provide sustenance. Several other indicate his right to wield in terms of spiritual matters. All of these things exist together. But look how, I love how the foot just lifts here. Again, this is beautiful curvilinear, broad shoulders. He looks boneless. You can see the arms almost look as boneless as his trunk. And in this case, he's clearly dancing. It's just hardly a more dynamic work of art on the world. Same thing here. Similar kind of construction, trident, sword, shield, bell, vajra, all of the implements indicating the power of creation. Now, here's where there's a little bit of trigger warning. We're going to be looking at some erotic scenes next. One of the things that really sets off the Lakshmana temple, and the Khajuraho group is how many of them have, not as main statuary groups, but off the main statuary group, erotic scenes. We see figures engaged in all kinds of sexual acts, mostly male, female, heterosexual acts, but not exclusively, which is interesting. And people don't even know how to, conceive of this. When these were first discovered, remember, medieval India has a great decline. Again, 13th, 14th century, they come under the domination first of the Deccan Sultanate and then the Mughal Empire. Muslims are very particular about idolatry. They don't like it. And B, they're really not into erotic scenes, at least not in this context. There's plenty of erotic scenes in Islamic art, but they're in books where you can put them away and see them in private, like God intended. Having erotic scenes and idols on temples is really not something the Muslims were in favor of, so they suppressed this greatly. Plus, you have a collapse of these kingdoms as they're conquered by Muslims. They don't have the means or the wealth to patronize these buildings anymore, and so they fall into disrepair. Most of these buildings that we see in this group are, in fact, recovered buildings. They are buildings that have been recovered since the time of the British Raj. So, there are these things that were lost to the jungles of India for centuries. Then the British come in, and you would think that the prudish Victorian British would want them destroyed, but as it turns out, not so much. They thought these were very exotic and beautiful, and there was a kind of contest there that existed. Indians by that time, after several hundred years of Muslim rule, really didn't have this tradition anymore. In fact, when you see Indian temples today, most Indian temples look more like Indo-Persian buildings than they look like native Indian architecture because of the long-standing influence of Islam. So when these things were recovered, they were actually very scandalous to the Indian population because they had been abandoned for centuries and their tastes and ideas of art had changed. Even Gandhi thought they were offensive and thought they should all just be destroyed. It's kind of weird. You would think that Gandhi, an Indian, would take pride in his native heritage. But eventually the British, preserved a lot of this culture. And the Indians have since come around to it. The Indians have fully embraced the diversity and multi-ethnicity of their culture. I mean, think about India. You think about India, and one of the first images that pops up for India is the Taj Mahal. It's this emblem of India. And yet, the Taj Mahal is a Muslim work of architecture. And the Mughals, who conquered India, were not native ethnically Indian. They married in with the Indians, but they were not natively ethnically Indian. And so that would have been seen as a building of oppression at one time. But now they've reclaimed it as their national identity, and they have reclaimed this as their national identity too. And now you're seeing lots of temples being built, new temples being built. India is actually thriving. It's a booming economy. And you're seeing lots of new Indian temples being built, not in an Indo-Persian style, which was the style that dominated from pretty much the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century on, but you're starting to see them being built more in a medieval Indian style. And they dearly love these buildings and have kind of reclaimed them, and also done a lot of research on understanding what's the nature. Why do we see such sexual activity, such explicit sexual activity on a religious building? And again, I have to stress, we can't look at this the way a Westerner would look at this. We're talking about the divine principle. Remember that every god has his consort. He has his Shakti, which represents an essence of him, his creative essence, but somehow can be separated as a separate deity that can be worshipped, but is really an aspect of them that is meant to teach you about them. Also remember, the Bhakti tradition, you have this devotional aspect where you are to be devoted to God. And the most common metaphor for that is that you and your God are to be as intimate as husband and wife. That is that, what could be more intimate than sex? And so therefore, this represents the intimacy of the devoted to divinity. And it also represents the intimacy of all of these things. You see these same kind of ideas in Christianity, to be perfectly blunt. In Christianity, you have these things, the two shall become one flesh in marriage. You have the story of the 10 virgins. The virgins are virgins of the bridegroom. They're going to be married to the bridegroom. They're going to consummate the marriage. Nobody thinks about that, but that's what a marriage means. The marriage is going to be consummated. So there's a kind of a sexual metaphor, an intimacy metaphor there. In Christianity, too. We don't talk about it in Sunday school because we're kind of prudish about it. But anciently, India wasn't so prudish. So when you see these wonderfully dynamic figures and the very variety of sex acts that exist, again, sometimes we can identify these as particular consorts. You can say, oh, well, this is Shiva and Parvati. So this is the divine union between him and his Shakti, his essence, or this creative power. Other times, they just seem to be devas. They just seem to be generic yaksha figures that are getting it on, but are again there to emphasize the divine aspect. But the all-over surface decoration, the beauty of the figures, backward poses, forward poses, S-curved spines, really there's just these incredibly beautiful tradition, dynamic figures, really wonderful stuff. And I'm glad that they didn't get destroyed. I'm glad that they were preserved. And again, as I've said before, in the 60s, there were a lot of people who got into Indian religions and Eastern religions and interpreted it in a particularly Western voyeuristic way, in a way that saw this as latently sexual and that it validated free love. I hate to break it to you. If you go to India, most Indians are pretty strict in their sexual morals. Indian families are pretty darn strict. Not only do they not approve of very traditional Indian families, not only do they not approve of sex before marriage, they don't even approve of dating before marriage, and lots of marriages are arranged. They're far more conservative in their sexual morals and their daily lives than even people in Utah Valley are. So again, don't misconceive of cultures. This is meant to be metaphor. This is meant to be analogy. And that was how it was meant to be understood. So let's go to the Chola period. So the Chola, remember, is the empire, same time period, starts 8th century, but goes up to the 12th, 13th century. And they're going to be down in the southern part of India, right down near the tip. Not Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's different. And we should look at some Sri Lanka images, but I don't know if we're going to have some time. I'm going to have to make some choices here. And the Chola are known for these exquisite bronzes. So we see these bronzes. Most of these bronzes are about 3 to 4 feet high. Some are larger. Some are almost life-size, but not quite life-size. They're just exquisite works. These are done in the lost wax technique. And one of the more common scenes that we see all kinds of scenes, but one of the most common scenes we see is Nataraja. So this is Shiva, Lord of the Dance. So it's not Michael Flatley who's Lord of the Dance, it's Shiva. And when Michael Flatley dies, he's going to have to have a word with Shiva for stealing his title. Okay, so Shiva is the Lord of the Dance, and this is the dance of destruction. So we see a variety of these forms that exist. You usually see them, he's ringed in flames. These are the flames of destruction. So here is Shiva. Let me walk you through the iconography of this. He is standing on a double lotus blossom that actually represents a drum. This is a drum. He has a similar drum in his hand. So he's actually dancing on a drum. So he's beating out the rhythm, and he's turning the drum in the hand to turn and beat the rhythm. By his dance, he works the work of destruction. So he is wreathed in a halo of flame. You can see the flames coming off. He holds the flame, the Agni, the fire of destruction, in his hands. These are his braids. This is to show that he is moving quickly, that he's in a mid-turn, and his hair is flying out in all direction. So in one hand he holds the drum, in one hand he holds the flame, and his two other hands come together to make this mudra. And the mudra is really a kind of fascinating hand gesture. The hand gesture itself is called the Damaru Hasta, the Damaru hand, which is this, that's the drum hand. The Damaru Hasta is the drum hand, looking in my notes. The foot comes up, is is representing his movement, his turn. And the hands come together into this mudra, which represents this turn. If you could see a person dancing this with the sash and the hair, you'd get a sense of it. This is all about communicating energy and spontaneity and quickness. And he stands on a dwarf. Remember, dwarfs are, this is Apasmara or Mara. This is this demon representing evil. So this is the destruction of the world. Now remember, in Hindu philosophy, everything is going to be destroyed. The world is a series of repeating cycles of creation, maintenance, preservation, and destruction. And all of these are natural parts of the cycle. So when we see destruction, we generally see destruction as an evil thing, but not in the Hindu world. In the Hindu world, destruction is just simply part of the cycle. You can't have rebirth unless you have death. You can't have a recreation unless you have a destruction. And the destruction exists to destroy evil and to cleanse the world so that it can start anew and it can start afresh. So this is a very positive image. It's interesting. We know Shiva from the very famous quote of Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer, the inventor of the atomic bomb, when they tested the atomic bomb at White Sands, he gave a quote from Hindu scriptures, as I become Shiva, destroyer of the world, and that seems kind of dark because the truth is that that's not what they mean by it. They mean something very differently. They mean this destruction that can give way to creation so that you can have order. So he dances on the dwarf, indicating his dominance over the dwarf. So you can see this in a variety of forms. Here he is, again, in this case, the halo of flame. The mandorla around him is a little bit more circular, but it's still the same principle. Here the flame is a little bit more stylized, but you do get this sense of the flame. And in the other hand, he holds the drum and dances upon the dwarf with his hair flying and the 1 foot raised to indicate, the change, the turn into the new age. And the hands are placed in this mudra, which indicate this turn, this change that's happening. Technically, all things are also just marvels of lost wax casting, cast in a single casting. One of the things that's really interesting about these is that they're not all of them, but a significant number of them are solid cast. And what I mean by that is typically when you cast something in a lost wax technique, it's done in a hollow casting. That is that, only the, a millimeter or two of the outer surface is actual bronze and the rest is hollow or contains a clay core or some kind of core. Not these puppies. These are solid bronze. So whereas something like this in regular bronze hollow casting might weigh a couple 100 pounds, in solid bronze, I mean, if you were to take a hacksaw to this guy's leg, instead of having a cross section, it would be just solid bronze all the way through. You'd wear out several blades cutting through it. It would be insane. So some of these things can weigh 2,000 pounds. That's a lot of bronze. So why on earth are you casting these things? First of all, it's very hard to cast that much bronze. Bronze, when it pools like that, it either cools very quickly as it goes into the smaller parts and solidifies, or it takes forever to solidify on the interior and it causes expansion and cracking. So it's actually easier to hollow cast these things than it is to solid cast these things. So why would you solid cast something like this? Well, you would solid cast this for a couple of reasons. One is prestige. The fact that you can just put that much wealthy material into it. Bronze is a very prestigious material, very wealthy, luxurious material, so it's conspicuous consumption. The other thing is that these things were set on altars and temples and shrines. And, something that's, relatively small, 80 to 200 pounds, you and a friend pick it up, you walk out with it if you need to steal it. If it's 2,000 pounds, nobody's touching that thing. That thing is sitting on that stone altar and it ain't moving. Nobody's walking away from it. As a matter of fact, there was one of these in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Curator told me this story. There was one of these in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, not terribly large, but it was solid bronze. And it was sitting on a pedestal, and the pedestal was just made out of 3/4 inch plywood. Which for any other statue in the world would have been adequate. but it wasn't. Now what's amazing is it stood for years on that base, and nothing happened. And one day, the plywood just gave out, just splintered to pieces, and the thing came crashing to the ground. Because it was solid, it wasn't damaged too much. It cracked the ground, it cracked the tiles, in fact. So when they built the pedestal for it, what they did is they put a steel I-beam, a steel column right underneath it, bolted it to the floor, and then put the plywood over the top. So it looks exactly identical, but it has this enormous steel support to it. Again, funny story, but it shows again how serious they were about these things. And these Chola era bronzes are just absolutely exquisite. This is again Shiva. Shiva emerges as again someone who protects you on your journey, and here he has the mace and all the other different things. Here he rides on his Vahana, the bull, and has the various attendants. This is all cast in bronze. Really kind of beautiful stuff. Gorgeous materials. All right, so that's 105. That's a pretty good place to stop. That gets us up to about the 12th, 13th century in India. And then we enter into the Muslim period, the Decadent Sultanate, and the Mughal period. But we'll come back and talk about that when we talk about Islam. From here on out, we're going to move to Southeast Asia, talk about what's happening in a few places in Southeast Asia, and then we'll move on to China. There is this later period on India where India, particularly in the mountainous regions of northern India, in the foothills of the Himalayas and places like Nepal, we have a whole new tradition of painting that emerges that's influenced by Indo-Persian painting, Pahari-style painting, that exists from the 17th and 18th and 19th century, but it's a late phenomenon. I don't know very much about it. I wanted to add it into this discussion here, but we're just pressed for time, so we're going to cut it out. Darn it. And we're going to try and move on because we do still have China, Japan, Korea, and Islam to get through, and I do want to get through by the end of the year. Thanks again for your patience. Thanks again for your patience over all the technical issues, and I will see you next time. Bye.